Amid the turmoil unleashed by the French Revolution in 1789, one of the most important events in human history, a great number of people lost their lives in the most bloody and violent ways. One of the most notable victims of the revolution is Maria Antoinette of Austria, wife of King Louis XVI and Queen Consort of France, who after a life marked not only by luxury and extravagance, but also by the intrigues of the court, now faces persecution directed at her and her family, ultimately being led to the scaffold for her execution by beheading. The decapitated head of Marie Antoinette marks the beginning of one of the most violent stages of the revolution, known as the Terror. But at the same time, it symbolizes the end, necessary for some and catastrophic for others, of the long monarchical tradition in France. Join us today to learn about the story of Marie Antoinette, her life, her key milestones, and her bitter end. My name is Alessandro Polentino, and this is La Nueva Enciclopedia. But before we start with today's story, we want to invite you to support our channel, to subscribe, to leave a like, and to leave your comments. We read all of them, so share our videos with each of your friends, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. So without anything else to add, let's begin today's story. Maria Antonieta Josefa Juanagas, Burgo Lorena, or better known as Marie Antoinette of Austria, was born on November 2, 1755, in the city of Vienna, the capital of the Archduchy of Austria, which was one of the most important states that made up what was then the Holy Roman Empire. This empire, one of the most prominent of its time, was a political entity characterized by being decentralized. That is, in which power did not rest exclusively with the empire, but was shared between it and multiple local entities, such as principalities, duchies, imperial cities, and archduchies. As was the case with Austria, where, as we saw, our protagonist was born. Marie Antoinette is the daughter of none other than the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Francis I of the Royal House of Lorraine, and his wife, Empress Maria Theresa I of the Royal House of Habsburg. However, Marie Antoinette is far from inheriting the throne, as she is the 15th child of the imperial couple. So Marie Antoinette's childhood passed without many worries in the Hofburg and Schönbrunn palaces in Vienna. Being especially protected by her mother, Marie Antoinette spends her early years away from imperial politics and monarchical intrigues. Rather, as a result of her environment full of luxury and comfort, she develops a cheerful, lively, outgoing, and charismatic personality.
Pero también inmadura e impulsiva según varios de sus biógrafos. Aunque es cierto que María Antonieta es poseedora de una inteligencia notable, no muestra inclinación por el riguroso estudio académico, sino que es propensa a las bellas artes, especialmente la música y la danza. De modo que su carácter oscilaba entre lo encantador.
Starting at the age of 12 around the year 1767, her mother begins to prepare her for a great personal and political challenge, which is to marry the Dauphin, also known as the Prince of France, Louis Auguste, of the House of Bourbon, and who will be the future Louis XVI, who is about a year and a half older than the young Marie Antoinette. This arranged marriage has the express purpose of resolving more than 2 centuries of conflict between the Royal House of Habsburg-Lorraine on one side and the House of Bourbon on the other, and promoting peace and cooperation between both royal houses. The preparation for Marie Antoinette for such a mission is quite rigorous, with private tutors teaching her everything about France, which, unlike the Holy Roman Empire, is a kingdom with substantial differences. These range from the absolute centralization of power in the monarch to the heavy influence of the French court in the affairs of the kingdom. Quickly, Marie Antoinette learns French, the history and culture of France, etiquette, and social skills specific to the French court. She ends up leaning more towards social skills, dance, and French music than towards the actual history of France. Her preparation, according to several biographies, turned out to be somewhat difficult due to the young Marie Antoinette's lack of willingness for rigorous study. Even so, After finishing her preparation at the age of 14, Marie Antoinette left Vienna and entered France through the city of Strasbourg on May 7, 1770 year. Out of 50 carriages, she changed her Austrian attire to French fashion, symbolizing her transition from Archduchess to Dauphine or Princess of France. After this, Marie Antoinette went to the city of Compiègne, 65 kilometers from Paris. It is here where she sees the Dauphin Louis Auguste for the first time. The first impression of the Dauphin or Prince turns out to be a bit disappointing. He is not as handsome as she had been told. He is shy, hesitant, and quite distant with his fiancée. Quite the opposite of the then King Louis XV, who gives the future Dauphine a warm welcome and shows great kindness to her. Even though the initial contact between them is not overflowing with love, especially because of Louis's ambivalent nature, Louis and Marie Antoinette get married on May 16, 1770. In the chapel of the lavish palace of Versailles, with more than 6,000 guests, there was a grand display of fireworks. It was a unique spectacle at that time. For Marie Antoinette, her marriage to Louis marks a turning point in her life in which her native Austria will now remain only in her memories. And with dignity and a bit of self-sacrifice, she must accept that the Kingdom of France is now her new home, and that one day she will be its queen. The first thing Marie Antoinette does, now as the Dauphine, that is, Princess of France, is to abandon her Austrian customs and adopt French customs. Among the most radical changes are giving up German and using only French in all areas of her life. The other is that the simple Austrian clothing is replaced by extravagant French dresses and hairstyles. And also that now Marie Antoinette must adopt an extremely elaborate court etiquette,
que contrasta con la libertad que gozaba en Viena. Y finalmente,
Marie Antoinette needs to understand that now, as the future Queen of France and as a princess of the same kingdom, she must have a busy public life with appearances and ceremonies. At the same time as the Dauphine of France, Marie Antoinette now takes up residence at the Palace of Versailles. This palace, one of the largest and most luxurious of its time, holds great social and political importance. The Palace of Versailles, located a few kilometers away from the city of Paris, is not simply the king's residence, but it is also the seat and residence of the king's court, which is made up almost entirely of the French nobility. The nobility was one of the three social classes, which we will talk about later, who lived in France during the so-called Ancien Régime, and whose origins go back to historic families that, during the medieval period, had obtained noble status through military or political merit. The nobility, although they enjoy ostentatious privileges and luxuries, also play a significant role at court in the affairs of the kingdom. Although the king has the final say and all powers are concentrated in him, the court advises the king and exerts its influence through military, administrative, and judicial positions throughout the kingdom. At the same time, the nobles were the owners of the lands where the common people worked and sought protection. So the Palace of Versailles is the political heart of France, and at the same time, socially, with its strict etiquette and refined customs. It is where values, manners, arts, music, and knowledge are defined, which govern, at least officially, daily life and even the hierarchy within the nobility itself. The same nobility which, over time, had degenerated into a ruling class not so concerned with governing the kingdom, but rather with feasts, dancing, and palace intrigues. Events that would contribute to the eventual fall of the French monarchy. This is the situation that Marie Antoinette, at 14 years old, faces when she moves to Versailles after her wedding. Marie Antoinette is not well regarded at the court of Versailles because she is a foreigner. In fact, the court refers to her disparagingly by the nickname the Austrian. At the same time, due to her well-documented beauty, the Dauphine was the object of envy among the ladies of the court. Meanwhile, her marriage to Louis faces several problems in its early years. Even given the fact that the affection between them is limited, Louis has serious difficulties having children with Marie Antoinette because of a physical problem affecting the Dauphin of France.
Al mantener relaciones con su esposa.
Therefore, the marriage becomes the subject of ridicule, and the issue of the marriage turns into a problem for the court of Versailles, with Marie Antoinette being criticized at court, her mother, Empress Maria Theresa III. The extensive and detailed correspondence between Marie Antoinette and her mother bears witness to the whirlwind of emotions the Dauphine is experiencing. Among them, nostalgia for her Austrian homeland and family, the stifling rigidity of the French court, the pressure to fulfill her role as future queen, and the anguish caused by the loneliness and social limitations she faces. In her letters, her mother advises her to bear her position as Dauphine with composure, dignity, and even elegance. As the beloved daughter of the Empress, she advises her to take care of her health and her image, and to carefully select her friends at court. With this mix of resignation and selfless persistence, Marie Antoinette experiences several of her most important milestones. After the death of King Louis XV in May 1774, the Dauphin Louis Auguste and the Dauphine Marie Antoinette, aged 20 and 19 respectively, finally ascend to the throne. With their coronation at the Cathedral of Reims on June 11, 1775, the ceremony is solemn and follows French monarchical tradition. During the ceremony, Louis and Marie Antoinette are seen exchanging glances and displays of affection, something that was not very common between the royal couple. However, the marital problems due to Louis's inability to impregnate Marie Antoinette continue for a while, causing concern and intrigue at court because of the lack of an heir. But all of this dissipates when in 1778 the now Queen Marie Antoinette gives birth on December 19 to her first daughter, Marie Thérèse. Giving birth turns out to be positive in some ways for Marie Antoinette, because it gradually improves her marital relationship with King Louis, strengthens her presence at court, and satisfies her personal desire for motherhood. After Marie Thérèse, other children of the royal couple would follow. In October 1781, Louis Joseph was born. In March 1785, Louis Charles was born. And in July 1786, Sophie was born. She died in June of the following year from tuberculosis, which caused great sadness for Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette's sadness deepens because of the court, which, since her arrival at the age of 14, has tried to discredit her, mostly because of her Austrian origins and the luxurious and, according to some, disproportionate lifestyle she maintains at Versailles. Despite the economic and social crisis in France during these years, which we will talk about later. This smear campaign against Marie Antoinette by the court was openly carried out through pamphlets, hallway rumors, and even songs that describe her as a frivolous, wasteful, and corrupt person. There are even rumors circulating that the queen is unfaithful to the king and that she is secretly attracted to her own sex. Others accuse her of wanting to rule France by exerting overwhelming influence over King Louis XVI when it comes to appointing and dismissing ministers and members of the court. Although this happens more than once, it never occurs as decisively as people think. In fact, trying to blame her for France's economic crisis, even though Marie Antoinette had very little to do with the kingdom's finances and financial decisions, the court nicknamed her Madame Deficit. Historians have pointed out that Marie Antoinette, as a monarch, only influenced the government when it came to defending her privileges and prerogatives, and also to defend her ministers and favorites in the hostile court environment at Versailles, which we've already talked about. A perfect example of this aversion of the court toward Marie Antoinette is the famous Affair of the Necklace, which happened during the pregnancy of her son, Louis Charles, in July 1785. A jeweler asked the queen for 1.5 million livres for a necklace supposedly ordered by her through Cardinal Louis de Rohan. However, Marie Antoinette, who had not made such an order, refuses to pay and confronts the cardinal. Quickly, a commotion breaks out. Finally, King Louis orders an investigation that determines that the necklace affair was due to a deception by a countess and her husband, who wanted to profit at the expense of Marie Antoinette. In light of this, Marie Antoinette and Cardinal de Rohan apologize to each other. But Marie Antoinette, even though she is innocent, is accused of being, quote, morally guilty in many ways by the court, something that turns out to be absurd according to several historians. This highlights the court's perennial animosity toward Marie Antoinette, which by the end of the 1780s, as a result of the same rejection by the court and the situation in France, accepts a considerable reduction in several of her personal expenses, especially regarding clothing, jewelry, and the decoration of the palace. This, just to give an example, Marie Antoinette, for example, orders the suspension of about 173 positions in her entourage and personal administration, ranging from servants and favorites to officials of the kingdom, which means a further reduction of her share in the total expenses of the monarchy. At the same time, during these years, she tries to get closer to her husband, the shy King Louis XVI, to show a more human side of the royal couple. The King of France, Louis XVI, Antoinette,
para mejorar la percepción popular de la monarquía. Y también comienza, aunque sin éxito por su falta de genio político, a implicarse más en los asuntos del reino, para mejorar la pesada situación que vivía Francia.
In this sense, in these desperate attempts to improve the image of the monarchy, the year 1789 arrives, in which all the French, from the humblest peasant to the
Esas coronadas del rey Luis y la reina
Antoinette, will experience the effects of the famous and sometimes infamous French Revolution. In order to understand the causes of the French Revolution, its controversial events, and the fate of many of its main figures, we must go back a few years. On the topic of the French Revolution, we already have an interesting video on our channel where, in 20 minutes, we cover in depth all the details of this important event in human history and in French history. So we recommend watching it. Before the French Revolution, society in France was divided into three estates, with the king above them and holding absolute power. Immediately below the king was the clergy of the Catholic Church, which held great political power at court and owned vast tracts of land, and at the same time governed, through religion, the social and moral life of the French people. Below the clergy was the nobility, who, as we have seen, were individuals and families with historic noble titles and large amounts of land, who assisted the king at court with the political and military governance of the kingdom. They were also the ones who enjoyed a luxurious life in the Palace of Versailles, which was both the residence of the king and the nobility, and from which the values and culture of the era emanated. Finally, below the nobility was the so-called third estate of society, which represented the majority of the population, had no political power, and included people from various social and economic backgrounds: peasants, artisans, the urban proletariat, and a new emerging class, the bourgeoisie, which included merchants, industrialists, bankers, professionals, and members of controversial secret societies, such as the Freemasons. For reasons ranging from marked social inequality to the influence of liberal and egalitarian ideas, from the Enlightenment to the activities of controversial secret societies, like the Freemasons. In the Third Estate and also in some sectors of the court and the clergy, it became hostility toward the nobility and the monarchy, considering the possibility of starting a revolution that would lead to a change in the social structures in France. This situation was encouraged by a marked economic crisis, mainly caused by wars and the disorder of the treasury in France, which led the kingdom to a bankruptcy that deeply affected the Third Estate. At the same time, the poor harvests of previous years, the rise in food prices, and the shortage of arable land worsened the situation for the peasants, plunging them into poverty. As is evident, the start of a revolution was only a matter of time, and from the ideas, the events, and the very organization of French society, the perfect breeding ground had been created for the outbreak to begin. Therefore, in view of the situation of the kingdom, King Louis XVI convened the Estates General on May 5, 1789. Each estate of society would have representatives to discuss possible reforms to improve the situation of the kingdom. However, the clergy and the nobility placed some limits on the voting rights of the representatives of the Third Estate, who, in an unprecedented act of rebellion, formed what they called a National Constituent Assembly and swore not to disband until they had given France a new constitution. This is the point of no return and the beginning of the Revolution. After a wave of violence that broke out across France, the famous storming of the Bastille took place on July 14, which symbolized the gradual takeover of power by the Assembly members and the violent revolutionary mobs throughout the country. Shortly after, on August 4, the Assembly abolished feudal privileges, causing many nobles to flee the country in terror. But in the midst of all this, where were King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette? Where is Queen Antoinette? Since the beginning of the Revolution, the royal family, although still performing their duties, also finds themselves with their freedom quite limited by the events. Some historians attribute the rapid, violent turn of the Revolution to King Louis XVI, since he, hesitant and ambivalent all his life, believed that the situation could return to normal after some time. However, the king was completely wrong. In this sense, between the 5th and 6th of October 1789, the so-called March on Versailles took place, in which hundreds of revolutionaries arrived at the Palace of Versailles with all kinds of weapons, with the aim of protesting the lack of food, including bread. Although this situation quickly degenerated into a violent mob that threatened to take over the royal palace, it was during this event that, according to some versions, Marie Antoinette mockingly said to the revolutionaries that iconic phrase, quote, "If they have no bread, let them eat cake," unquote. However, this claim has already been debunked by several of her biographers who have not found convincing evidence that such words were spoken by Marie Antoinette during the March on Versailles. Even so, the situation at the Palace of Versailles became more tense after the violent entry of the revolutionaries and the death of several royal guards. Marie Antoinette is about to lose her life to the enraged mob. However, she manages to escape through a door to a safer part of the palace. When it seemed that day would be the royal family's last day alive, the situation is quickly calmed by troops under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette, who manages to soothe the crowd by appearing on the balcony, both with the king and with Marie Antoinette, whom the revolutionaries, as is known, were willing to kill that day. After the events at Versailles, the king has no choice but to accept it. One of the demands of the revolutionaries was that he move to live with his entire family in Paris, in the Tuileries Palace, which, before the construction of Versailles, had been the royal residence for several years. So in the following days, the unprecedented return of the monarchs to Paris took place. By then, Paris had become the epicenter of the revolution and its most radical measures. Although theoretically free, Marie Antoinette and the king live under constant intimidation and supervision by the revolutionaries, are practically their prisoners. Trapped in the Tuileries, Marie Antoinette witnesses the rapid fading of the monarchy's power in France. This leads to the so-called Flight to Varennes on June 20, 1791, in which King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette unsuccessfully attempt to escape the country. This event, along with ignoring her brothers in Austria, inflames tensions. The spirits of the revolutionaries, who coerce Louis XVI on September 14, 1791, to swear loyalty to the Constitution sanctioned by the Constituent Assembly. In this way, France becomes a constitutional monarchy where the king now has a purely symbolic and greatly reduced power. After this, the fall of the monarchy is a domino effect. The following year, on August 10, 1792, the assault on the Tuileries Palace takes place, in which the king and his family are arrested and taken to the Temple Tower, an ancient medieval structure built by the Templars in the heart of Paris. Shortly after, on the 21st, the Republic is proclaimed and the monarchy is completely abolished. The monarchy is left so discredited after his imprisonment that King Louis XIII, who was supposed to be addressed as His Majesty, now the convention forces all citizens to call him Citizen Louis Capet, in reference to the Capetian dynasty from which Louis descended, and with the purpose of desacralizing the figure of the king. Once the National Convention was organized as the new governing body, on January 20th, it held a trial of Louis XVI on charges of treason for seeking the support of foreign powers to restore the monarchy in France. The trial is controversial, with voices both for and against, but in the end, the convention decides to execute the king by guillotine. The news devastates Marie Antoinette, who along with the king is present during the trial, in which neither of them could intervene. In his final hours, she has no choice but to comfort her husband, who is executed the next morning on January 21, 1793. The execution of Louis XVI shatters Marie Antoinette's life in every way. The revolutionaries send her to the Conciergerie prison, far from the Temple Tower, where her two children, Maria Theresa and Louis Charles, are still being held, whom she has loved deeply all her life. In the Conciergerie, Marie Antoinette, now pejoratively nicknamed the Widow Capet, experiences a rapid physical and mental decline due to her husband's death. The inability to see her children, the loss of her previous lifestyle, and everything that was once ordinary for her. In the following months, what became known in the French Revolution as the Reign of Terror begins, during which death, hunger, and chaos will reign throughout France. At the hands of controversial figures such as Maximilien Robespierre. We have an interesting video where we go in depth about that period of terror during the Revolution. However, going back to Marie Antoinette, executing her while she was still a prisoner remained unfinished business for the revolutionaries. Even before the revolution, the Austrian was rejected by the court. Now, with the new situation in France, the hatred toward her spread to more sectors of the population and to all the members of the convention. So in September 1793, the convention began proceedings against her. The court accused her of conspiring against the security of the state, of corruption, and of conspiring with foreign powers to invade France. Although some historians say the evidence presented
contra María Antonieta eran insuficientes y fueron buscadas a toda prisa.
Marie Antoinette defends herself bravely, but on October 15, 1793, the court delivers a swift sentence: execution by guillotine the following day. Marie Antoinette, without protest, knows that her fate is sealed. On the morning of October 16, Marie Antoinette prepares for her transfer from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution, today called Place de la Concorde, which was the scene of the bloodiest executions during the Revolutionary period. On the morning of the 16th, Marie Antoinette has only a French broth called bouillon for breakfast and is required to dress in white, since the revolutionaries thought that wearing black for mourning could cause a stir. Afterwards, her hair is cut, it is burned to prevent it from becoming a religious relic, her hands are tied behind her back, she is placed in a very simple carriage, and she heads toward the Place de la Révolution. When she arrives at the square, the crowd insults the queen all along her way to the scaffold. It is said that her last words were spoken as she climbed the steps to the scaffold, when she accidentally stepped on the executioner's feet, who interestingly was the son of the executioner who executed her husband, Louis XV, saying, open quote, "Sir, I beg your pardon, I did not do it on purpose," close quote. Climbing the stairs, Marie Antoinette does not give a speech as her late husband did. Quickly, the executioners place her head in the stocks and, without hesitation, at 2:15 in the afternoon, they let the heavy blade of the guillotine fall, which severs Marie Antoinette's head in a single stroke. Immediately, her executioner raises the queen's bloodied head and shouts, "Long live the Republic!" But the witnesses, who were previously rowdy, are left stunned by the scene, falling into a deathly silence and quickly dispersing. Immediately afterward, the body of Marie Antoinette, with her head between her legs, is placed in a mass grave along with her husband's and sprinkled with quicklime to speed up its decomposition. Years later, after the extraordinary events, in 1815 the remains of the royal couple are taken to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where they rest in the necropolis of the kings of France to this day. In this way, the life of Marie Antoinette of Austria comes to an end, the Queen of France for some, the Austrian for others, and the widow of Capet toward the end of her life. Rather than someone to blame or hold responsible, Marie Antoinette stands as one of the many victims of the French Revolution, in which not only the monarchs, but also tens of thousands of peasants and people whom the revolutionaries themselves had sworn to dignify, lost their lives. Thus the life of Marie Antoinette of Austria, born into luxury and dead in a public square, starkly exemplifies that era when France experienced one of the most important events in its history and in human history, and that forever changed the political, economic, and social structures of the entire world. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. We hope you enjoyed it. We remind you that your support is essential for the growth of this great project. That's why we invite you to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share our content with all your friends, and stay tuned for upcoming releases. See you next time.